Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a journey back in time, way back to ancient Greece, and explore a topic that probably looks nothing like what you're imagining. Forget swiping right, awkward first coffee dates, or even just casually hanging out. Because if you were a young person living in, say, classical Athens, the very concept of dating, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist. Imagine a world where romance, attraction, and personal choice played a shockingly small role in finding a partner. You're about to step into a society where love and marriage were two very, very different things. And trust me, you probably won't survive this romantic wilderness with your modern sensibilities intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You might envision young Athenians strolling hand in hand through olive groves, exchanging flirtatious glances at the agora, or penning heartfelt sonnets to their crushes. And if that's your mental image, you need to hit the reset button, because that's not how things worked. The idea of two individuals, particularly a man and a woman, independently choosing to spend time together to get to know each other, to gauge compatibility, or to develop romantic feelings before committing to a lifelong partnership was largely foreign, if not outright scandalous. The social structures, the legal framework, and the cultural expectations of ancient Greece, particularly in a city-state like Athens, were all designed to prevent such spontaneous and individualistic pursuits. It's less like a rom-com and more like a very rigid, state-sanctioned, arranged business merger. For men, your social world might involve the agora marketplace, the gymnasium, or the symposium, a male drinking party. You'd interact with other men, engaging in philosophical debate, political discussions, or athletic pursuits. You might form deep friendships, intellectual bonds, or even romantic connections with other men, as male-male relationships were an accepted, if complex, part of Athenian society. But interaction with respectable, unmarried women that was virtually non-existent. It was like trying to find a unicorn at a philosophy lecture. Not impossible, perhaps, but highly improbable and probably frowned upon. For women, especially respectable unmarried girls, your life was one of strict seclusion. You spent almost all your time within the genikon, the women's quarters of your family home, under the watchful eye of your mother or female relatives. Your world was domestic learning household management, weaving, and preparing for your eventual role as a wife and mother. Going out alone, even to the market, was highly unusual and generally considered improper. Your public appearances would be rare and highly chaperoned, perhaps at religious festivals or very specific family events. The chance of you meeting cute with a potential suitor, let alone going on a date, was less than zero. It was less like going out and finding love and more like being a very valuable, very well-guarded piece of antique pottery. Mainstream historical fact. The concept of dating for romantic purposes, as understood in modern Western societies, did not exist in ancient Greece, particularly in classical Athens, where marriages were typically arranged by families for social and economic reasons. Here's a quirky tidbit. While formal dating was absent, there are hints in ancient poetry and drama of young men occasionally trying to catch a glimpse of respectable girls at public wells or during religious processions, perhaps exchanging a fleeting glance. It was a subtle, almost secret form of observation, not interaction, akin to discreetly looking at someone's LinkedIn profile before sending a connection request. But without the actual connect button, you certainly couldn't just walk up and offer to buy them a metaphorical coffee. Open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue about the precise degree of seclusion experienced by Athenian women, with some scholars emphasizing the strictness of the gynekon and limited public life, while others suggest there might have been more informal opportunities for interaction, especially in lower social classes, than the elite male-authored texts suggest. The nuances of female social freedom remain a point of discussion. The goal wasn't to find the one for love, but to find the right family for a strategic alliance. Marriage was a social and economic institution, a way to secure property, extend family influence, and ensure the continuation of the male lineage. Personal attraction, while perhaps a bonus, was certainly not a prerequisite. In fact, it might even have been seen as a dangerous distraction from the true purpose of the union. So, if you're imagining a romantic comedy set in ancient Greece, you're in for a rude awakening. There are no meet-cutes, no shared glances across crowded rooms, and certainly no awkward first dates. Your path to partnership, if you were a respectable Athenian, was dictated by your family, driven by practical considerations, and utterly devoid of anything resembling modern courtship rituals. It's a boring history for sleep, perhaps, but it's a fascinating look at a world where finding a partner was a transaction, not a romantic adventure. Yes, you've absorbed the rather stark reality that dating as a concept was essentially non-existent in ancient Greece. Instead, your path to partnership was firmly rooted in a very different institution, marriage as a family business. This wasn't about two hearts finding each other. It was about two households, two oikoi, forging an alliance, securing property, and ensuring lineage. For you, the prospective bride or groom, your role was less about personal choice and more about dutiful participation in a larger social and economic strategy. Imagine your father, the Kyrios guardian or master of your household, sitting down with another Kyrios in a serious discussion, not over a game of backgammon or the latest philosophical treatise, but over the future of your family's assets and your reproductive potential. These were the real meetings that decided your marital fate. Marriage was primarily an agreement between the groom and the bride's father, or male guardian. The woman herself, regardless of her age, had little to no say in the matter. She was, in essence, a valuable commodity being transferred from one household to another, along with a dowry. It sounds terribly unromantic, doesn't it? Because it was a transaction, a contractual arrangement for mutual benefit, albeit one with very personal consequences for you. The primary goals of these arranged marriages were clear: to produce legitimate children, especially male heirs, to continue the family line and ensure the worship of ancestral gods, to solidify social standing, and to consolidate or expand wealth through the exchange of dowries and land. Love, if it ever developed, was considered a fortunate byproduct, not a prerequisite. It was a pleasant bonus, like finding a perfectly ripe fig in your garden. Nice, but not what you planted the tree for. The tree was for figs. Period. For the bride's family, marrying off a daughter meant securing a good match that would protect her interests, ensure her fertility, and thus the continuation of her new husband's line, and maintain good relations between the families. For the groom's family, it was about finding a respectable, fertile woman who would bring a suitable dowry and bear healthy children to continue their lineage. There was no pretense of personal affection being the driving force. It was all about lineage and legacy. Mainstream historical fact. Marriage in ancient Greece, particularly in Athens, was primarily a social and economic institution arranged by the bride's and groom's families, focusing on property, lineage, and the production of legitimate heirs, rather than romantic love or individual choice. Here's a quirky tidbit. While the bride typically had no say, there are rare mentions in some comedic plays or legal speeches of instances where a woman might express a preference or a reluctance, usually through her male guardian. However, these were often played for comedic effect or highlighted unusual circumstances, rather than representing common practice. It's like seeing a news report about a cat becoming mayor. Entertaining, but not a sign of widespread feline political empowerment. Open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue about the extent to which women in ancient Greece, despite the patriarchal legal framework, exerted informal influence over marriage negotiations, perhaps through persuasion of their male guardians or within the context of family dynamics. A nuanced point of discussion. The arrangements could begin quite early. While formal marriage usually happened when girls were in their mid-teens and men in their late 20s or early 30s, the discussions and informal agreements between families could start well before that. This meant that from a young age, you, as a girl, would be aware that your future was already being mapped out, not by your dreams, but by your father's negotiations. You weren't dreaming of a prince. You were probably aware of which neighboring oikos had a suitable male heir and a decent olive grove. This system, while lacking in modern romance, provided a certain societal stability. Marriages weren't prone to the vagaries of personal emotion, which could be fleeting. Instead, they were built on solid foundations of shared economic interest and social standing, designed to last and serve the community. However, for the individuals involved, particularly the women, it meant a profound lack of personal autonomy and choice in one of the most fundamental aspects of life. You were a piece in a larger puzzle, a crucial, vital piece, but a piece nonetheless, moved by the hands of your elders. It's a boring history for Sleep. Yes, but it's a revealing look at how family, property, and power dictated love's place in the ancient Greek world. You've grasped that marriage was a familial transaction, not a romantic quest. Now, let's shift our perspective to the other side of that negotiation table, the groom. If you were a young man in ancient Greece, say, an Athenian, your path to finding a wife was equally structured, though with significantly more agency than your female counterpart. You weren't exactly dating, but you were certainly seeking, albeit with your father as the primary negotiator. Imagine yourself as a young Athenian man, perhaps in your late 20s or early 30s. You've completed your military training, you're educated, and you're ready to establish your own oikos, your household. The idea of choosing your own wife based on personal attraction might float around in romantic poems, but in reality, your father, the Kyrios of your family, would be the central figure in finding you a suitable match. This wasn't a casual suggestion. It was a serious discussion about the future of the family lineage and property. Your father would act as your agent, looking for a bride who came from a respectable family, ideally with a good dowry, and who was known to be modest, capable in household management, and, crucially, fertile. He would likely seek out families with whom your oikos already had good relations, or those whose alliance would be politically or economically advantageous. Think of it as a very serious, high-stakes networking event. But instead of trading business cards, they're trading information about potential in-laws and property values, while you, as the groom, wouldn't be doing any dating in the modern sense. You might have had a limited degree of input. Your father might present a few options, and you might express a preference, particularly if you'd heard good things about a certain family's reputation or the prospective bride's character, which was often gleaned from her family's reputation. Not personal interaction. However, your father's decision would be paramount, driven by the pragmatic interests of the family unit. Your preferences were a consideration, not a determinant. It's like your dad presenting you with a list of approved career paths, and you get to pick from 3 equally sensible options. Mainstream historical fact: for young men in ancient Greece, marriage proposals were typically initiated by their fathers or male guardians, who would negotiate directly with the bride's father to arrange the union based on familial, social, and economic considerations. Here's a quirky tidbit. While direct interaction with potential brides was rare, sometimes a young man might catch a glimpse of an unmarried girl at a religious festival or procession. These fleeting sightings could potentially spark an initial interest, which he would then convey to his father. It's the ancient Greek equivalent of seeing someone at a party and then asking your mutual friend, "Hey, who was that?" before your dad then contacts their dad for a formal meeting. Open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue about the precise degree of agency young men had in selecting their wives, with some scholars suggesting that while ostensibly arranged, a son's preferences might hold significant informal weight in family discussions, while others emphasize the overriding authority of the Kyrios in these crucial decisions. The nuance of male choice within arranged marriage structures remains a point of discussion. The age difference between you and your prospective bride would likely be significant. While you, the groom, might be in your late 20s or early 30s, the bride would typically be much younger, often between 14 and 18 years old. This age gap was seen as practical. The man was established and ready to head a household, while the girl was considered mature enough for childbearing and domestic duties, but young enough to be easily trained and adapt to her new household. It's less about a love connection and more about finding a suitable partner for a new domestic venture. It also conveniently ensured the husband's dominance in the marriage. Once an agreement was reached, the engagement, the engi, or giving in pledge, was a formal legal act, usually involving a handshake between the two fathers. This was the binding part, not a romantic declaration. The wedding itself, the gamos, would follow, often within a short period. There were no long engagements or extensive periods of courtship. The deal was done, and the next step was to make it official and begin the process of producing heirs. So, for you, the young Athenian man, the journey to marriage wasn't about dating in search of a soulmate. It was a paternal process of negotiation and strategic alliance building. Your father was your wingman, your headhunter, and your legal counsel all rolled into one. Your future wife was chosen for you, based on what was best for the oikos, not necessarily for your heart. It's a boring history for sleep, perhaps, but it's a fascinating look at a world where even the groom's romantic aspirations took a back seat to familial duty. You've just gotten a glimpse into the structured, familial approach to marriage from the groom's side. Now, let's immerse ourselves in the daily reality of the prospective bride, because if you were a young, unmarried girl in ancient Greece, particularly in classical Athens, your life was characterized by something that would feel incredibly stifling to modern sensibilities: strict seclusion. Forget any notions of teenage independence, social outings with friends, or even casual interaction with boys your age. Your world was, for the most part, the gynekon, the women's quarters of your family home. Imagine your days. From early childhood, your life revolved around the domestic sphere. You would spend most of your time indoors, learning essential household skills from your mother, aunts, or older female slaves. This included spinning wool, weaving textiles, a highly valued skill, managing household provisions, and overseeing the younger children. Your education was practical, geared entirely towards preparing you for your future role as a wife and manager of your own oikos. There were no schools for girls outside the home, no public forums for debate, no gymnasia for physical training unless you were in Sparta, which was a very different story. It's like being in perpetual homeschooling, but the curriculum is exclusively Domestic Arts 101, and your only classmates are your immediate family. Your interaction with men, even within your own household, was limited. While you'd certainly see your father and brothers, formal interactions were often brief and purposeful. With men outside your immediate family, contact was virtually non-existent. This extreme segregation was not meant as a punishment. It was considered the hallmark of a respectable upbringing. A girl's modesty and chastity were paramount, directly linked to her family's honor and her future marriage prospects. The less seen, the less heard, the more valuable she was considered. It's a societal standard that put a premium on invisibility. Public appearances for an unmarried girl were rare and highly controlled. You might attend major religious festivals or processions, but always heavily chaperoned, likely veiled or cloaked, and surrounded by other female relatives or slaves. These were not opportunities for social mingling. They were solemn civic duties. The goal was to participate in the ritual, not to draw individual attention. Any lingering glance, any unseemly interaction, could bring shame upon your family and jeopardize your future. It's like attending a very formal, silent parade, where your main job is to blend in completely. Mainstream historical fact: respectable unmarried girls in classical Athens lived largely secluded lives within the gynekon women's quarters of their homes, with very limited public appearances, and their education was primarily focused on domestic skills. Here's a quirky tidbit. While the gynekon was the designated women's space, the layout of ancient Greek houses often meant it wasn't a completely separate, locked-off area. It was more about social boundaries and norms, with women generally occupying the inner, more private rooms, especially when male visitors were present. So, while you might not have been literally chained up, the social expectations were a far more powerful restraint. It's like having a designated "no boys allowed" fort in your house. But the fort is also your entire life. Open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue about the precise architectural and social implications of the gynekon, with some scholars emphasizing its role in enforcing extreme female seclusion, while others suggest its function varied by social class and practical household needs, and that women might have informally navigated these spaces more freely than commonly depicted in male texts. The fluidity of domestic spatial use remains a nuanced point of discussion. The strictness of your seclusion meant that you would likely not meet your future husband until very close to the wedding day, if at all. The arrangements would be handled by your father, and your primary role was to accept his decision gracefully. There was no opportunity for you to get to know your prospective spouse, to gauge his personality, or to develop any emotional connection before the marriage. Your world was about to expand dramatically, from the confines of your father's house to the confines of your husband's house, and the man who would be your partner for life would largely be a stranger. This intense preparation for marriage, this almost monastic seclusion, highlights the immense societal pressure on you to be a virtuous, chaste, and compliant bride. Your honor, and by extension, your family's honor, rested heavily on your premarital purity and your ability to transition seamlessly into your new role. It's a boring history for sleep, perhaps, but it's a profound look at a young woman's journey into an arranged marriage, a journey defined not by romance, but by the quiet, unyielding strictures of societal expectation. You've just walked through the strictly secluded life of an unmarried Athenian girl, a life meticulously designed to preserve your chastity and ensure your suitability as a future bride. Now, let's talk about one of the most crucial, indeed, indispensable, elements of marriage negotiations in ancient Greece: the dowry. Forget engagement rings or elaborate wedding gifts. The dowry was the financial backbone of the marriage contract, a testament to the practical economic realities underpinning these unions. For you, the prospective bride, the dowry was less a personal asset and more a vital component of your transfer from one oikos to another. Imagine your father, the Kyrios, discussing not just your virtues, but the specific value of the assets he would transfer with you to your husband's household. The dowry, or fern, wasn't a payment for you. Rather, it was a substantial financial contribution that remained legally your property, even after marriage. However, it was controlled and managed by your husband. Think of it like a trust fund that your husband has complete access to. But legally, it's still earmarked for your financial security. It's a bit like buying a car, but the money for the car technically still belongs to your parents, and the car itself is collateral. This dowry could take various forms: land, money, jewelry, household goods, or even slaves. Its value was determined by the social standing and wealth of your family. A larger, more respectable dowry reflected positively on your family's status and could secure a more advantageous marriage for you. For the groom's family, the dowry was a significant financial asset, contributing to the upkeep of the new couple's household and, critically, providing financial security for you in case of divorce or your husband's death. The dowry served several critical purposes. Firstly, it legitimized the marriage. A marriage without a dowry was considered highly irregular, almost invalid, and could compromise the legitimacy of any children born from the union. So, it was absolutely essential for proper social recognition. Secondly, it provided for your maintenance within your new husband's household. It ensured that you weren't a financial burden, but came with your own means of support. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, it offered you a degree of protection. If your husband divorced you, he was legally obligated to return your dowry to your father or guardian. Failure to do so would incur interest and bring him shame, making it a powerful disincentive against arbitrary abandonment. It was your ancient Greek financial safety net, a little less exciting than an emergency credit card, but far more impactful. Mainstream historical fact: the dowry fern was a crucial financial and legal component of marriage in ancient Greece, owned by the wife but managed by her husband, providing for her maintenance and security, and was legally required to be returned in case of divorce. Here's a quirky tidbit. While the dowry was typically provided by the bride's father, if a father died without male heirs, his daughter, known as an epikleros, would inherit his estate, but was legally compelled to marry her nearest male relative, often her uncle or cousin, to keep the property within the family. In such cases, her dowry was essentially the inherited estate itself, making her a very desirable, albeit legally constrained, bride. It's like winning the lottery, but the prize comes with a mandatory marriage clause to your second cousin. open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue about the precise extent to which dowries empowered women by providing them with economic security and a legal claim to property, versus solidifying their status as objects of financial transaction within a patriarchal system. The true impact of the dowry system on female agency remains a nuanced point of discussion. The negotiation of the dowry would be a tense, formal affair between the two Kyrioi. This was serious business, reflecting the wealth and standing of both families. You, as the bride, would not be present at these discussions. Your value was being assessed and determined by the male heads of your respective households. It further underscores the impersonal nature of these unions from a modern romantic perspective. For women who came from poorer families, or those without a living male guardian, securing a dowry could be incredibly challenging, making it difficult to find a respectable marriage match. The dowry system, while providing security, also reinforced social hierarchies and could leave vulnerable women even more marginalized. So, your journey to marriage in ancient Greece wasn't about hearts and flowers. It was about assets and agreements. The dowry was not merely a tradition, it was the bedrock of your marital contract, a financial safeguard, and a symbol of your family's honor. It ensures your place in your new household, but also highlights your lack of personal agency in choosing that place. It's a boring history for sleep, perhaps, but it's a profound look at how even the most personal relationships were shaped by the cold, hard currency of ancient Greek society. You've absorbed the economic significance of the dowry, recognizing it as a crucial component of your entry into marriage. Now, let's talk about another striking characteristic of ancient Greek unions that would feel profoundly unusual to modern eyes: the significant age gaps between spouses. Forget marrying someone close to your own age, or even within a 5-year range. For you, the young Greek woman, your husband would typically be much older, creating a dynamic that further underscored the non-romantic, practical nature of these alliances. Imagine your wedding day. You, as the bride, are likely in your mid-teens, perhaps 14, 15, or 16 years old. Your body is just beginning to transition into womanhood. You're still very much under the strict tutelage of your mother, and your understanding of the world is largely confined to the domestic sphere. Then, standing opposite you, is your husband, a man in his late 20s, 30s, or even occasionally in his 40s. He is fully adult, established in society, experienced in public life, and ready to head his own household. This wasn't an anomaly. It was the prevailing norm across most of ancient Greece, particularly in Athens. It's like marrying your high school principal, if he were also your legal guardian and controlled all your money. This age disparity was not accidental. It was a deliberate societal construct, rooted in practical and patriarchal considerations. For the man, marrying a much younger woman meant several things. Firstly, it maximized her reproductive potential. A younger bride meant more years of childbearing, increasing the likelihood of producing multiple male heirs to secure the family line. Secondly, a younger bride was considered more pliable and easier to train in the ways of her new household. She would have fewer ingrained habits from her paternal home and would be more amenable to adapting to her husband's authority and the customs of his oikos. This ensured domestic harmony and the husband's unquestioned dominance. For you, the young bride, this age gap meant entering a marriage where your husband was not just your spouse, but also effectively your guardian and teacher. Your primary role was to learn from him, to be instructed in the ways of his household, and to defer to his authority. There was little expectation of intellectual companionship or shared life experiences in the way we understand it today. He was the head, the master, the Kyrios of your new life. You were the obedient wife, the mother of his children, and the manager of his domestic affairs under his guidance. It's like being a perpetual apprentice. Only the apprenticeship is for life and involves a lot of childbirth. Mainstream historical fact. Marriages in ancient Greece typically involved significant age differences, with brides commonly being in their mid-teens around 1418 and grooms in their late 20s or early 30s. A practice driven by reproductive and patriarchal societal norms. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some scholars suggest that this age gap, combined with the extreme seclusion of young women, meant that many brides would have very little idea of what their husband even looked like, beyond perhaps a fleeting glimpse from afar, until their wedding day. Imagine the grand reveal, not of a beautiful dress, but of the person you're now legally bound to, who is also twice your age. It certainly adds an extra layer of getting to know you to the wedding night, open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of these large age disparities on the women involved, with some scholars suggesting it fostered a paternalistic, yet stable, marital dynamic, while others contend it could lead to isolation and a lack of emotional intimacy for the younger bride. The subjective experience of such unions remains a nuanced point of discussion. The significant age gap also reinforced the notion that marriage was not about finding an emotional equal or a romantic partner. It was about fulfilling societal roles: the man, the established household head, the woman, the fertile vessel and domestic manager. Any love or affection that grew between spouses was a consequence of living together and fulfilling their duties, not the foundation upon which the union was built. It was a partnership of function, not of feeling. So, as you prepared for your wedding day, you wouldn't be dreaming of a dashing young man your own age. Instead, you would be preparing to join the household of an older, established man, whose experience and authority would guide your new life. The age gap was a constant, unspoken reminder of your role to be a diligent wife, a fertile mother, and a compliant manager of his oikos. It's a boring history for sleep, perhaps, but it's a telling detail about the pragmatic, often stark realities of ancient Greek matrimony. You've absorbed the reality of significant age gaps, understanding that your husband would be considerably older and more established. This leads us to perhaps the most jarring truth about dating in ancient Greece. For respectable citizens, your first date was likely your wedding day introduction. Forget courtship rituals, intimate conversations, or even a shared meal beforehand. For you, the bride, and often for the groom as well, your wedding was less a celebration of an existing bond and more the formal beginning of an acquaintance, a contractual agreement made physical. Imagine the days leading up to your wedding. You've been secluded in your gynekon, meticulously prepared by your mother and female attendants. You might have heard whispers about your future husband's family, his reputation, or his wealth. But direct knowledge of the man himself would be incredibly scarce. You wouldn't have seen him up close, spoken to him freely, or shared a single moment of casual interaction. Your knowledge of him would be based on reports, not experience. It's like being set up on a blind date by your parents. Only the date is for life, and the ring is already on your finger. The wedding ceremony itself, the gamos, wasn't about public declarations of love. It was a series of rituals focused on the transfer of the bride from her father's oikos to her husband's. The procession, often at night, would involve you riding in a chariot or cart, accompanied by torches, music, and your family and friends. This was your public debut as a bride, marking your transition. But even during this procession, direct interaction with your husband would be minimal. The moment you first truly interacted with your husband, or saw him clearly up close, might have been at his home. You, a young teenager, would be led into his unfamiliar house, introduced to his family, and formally brought into his oikos. This was the moment you truly began your life with a man who, until that very instant, was essentially a stranger. Your relationship was built not on pre-existing affection, but on shared domesticity and the fulfillment of marital duties from that moment forward. It's a bit like signing up for a lifelong group project with someone you've only ever corresponded with via email. Mainstream historical fact. For many respectable women in ancient Greece, particularly in classical Athens, their first direct sustained interaction with their future husband often occurred on their wedding day. As marriages were arranged and premarital social mingling was highly restricted. Here's a quirky tidbit. While the wedding night was the official beginning of the marital relationship, ancient Greek art and poetry sometimes hint at a certain awkwardness or even fear on the part of the young bride. It wasn't always a joyous, romantic occasion. It was a profound, life-altering transition into the unknown, with a man she barely knew. Imagine the bridal jitters, but amplified by the fact that you're essentially meeting your husband for the first time in a deeply intimate setting. Open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue about the extent to which genuine emotional bonds could develop between spouses in these arranged marriages, with significant age gaps and limited premarital interaction. With some scholars suggesting affection often grew out of shared life and mutual respect, while others contend that true intimacy might have been rare or confined to specific, less common circumstances. The nature of emotional connection in such unions remains a nuanced point of discussion. The goal of the marriage was clear from the outset to produce legitimate children, especially male heirs, to secure the lineage. The concept of romantic love as a foundation for marriage was largely a poetic ideal, disconnected from the practical realities of everyday life. Affection, if it developed, was expected to grow within the marriage, nurtured by shared duties and the raising of a family, rather than preceding it. It was seen as a product of the union, not its cause. This approach to marriage meant that fidelity, for the wife, was paramount, ensuring the legitimacy of heirs. For the husband, while his wife's fidelity was crucial, his own sexual conduct outside the marriage was often tolerated, provided it did not involve other respectable citizen women. This double standard further highlighted the transactional nature of the marital bond. So, your wedding day wasn't a culmination of a romantic journey. It was the start of a domestic contract. You, the young bride, were transitioning from one male guardian to another, entering a new household where your primary duty was to manage it and bear children for your new husband. It's a boring history for sleep, perhaps, but it's a profound look at a time when marriage was about merging families and securing futures, not about two people falling in love. You've absorbed the rather stark reality that respectable Athenian women had virtually no dating life and often met their husbands on their wedding day. So, where did men find companionship or express romantic interest outside of these rigid marital structures? This leads us to a fascinating and complex aspect of ancient Greek society, the significant role of prostitutes, particularly the distinguished class of hetairai, who offered a very different kind of date and companionship. Imagine being a man in ancient Athens. Your wife, while essential for managing your household and bearing legitimate heirs, was often a young, secluded woman. chosen for familial reasons, not intellectual or romantic compatibility. Your social and intellectual life, as discussed, primarily revolved around other men. This created a social void for certain types of companionship, a void that was filled by various classes of prostitutes. This isn't to say all male-female interaction outside marriage was illicit, but the respectable options were minimal to non-existent for casual, non-familial socializing. At the lowest end of the spectrum were the common prostitutes, or porni, who operated in brothels and were often slaves or foreign women. Their services were purely sexual, transactional, and held very little social standing. They were the most accessible option for a man seeking immediate physical gratification, without any pretense of deeper connection. It's like opting for a quick, anonymous transaction rather than investing in a long-term relationship, purely for convenience. But then there was the unique phenomenon of the hetairae singular hetaira, meaning companion. These women were a distinct class of courtesans, typically foreign-born or freedwomen, who were often highly educated, culturally sophisticated, and intellectually accomplished. Unlike respectable citizen women, hetairae were free to move about in public, attend symposia male drinking parties, and engage in witty conversation and intellectual debate with men. They could play musical instruments, recite poetry, and discuss philosophy. They offered not just sexual services, but also intellectual companionship, social graces, and stimulating conversation. That respectable wives were generally not trained or permitted to provide. For a man, spending time with a hetaira was a form of dating in a very broad sense, a way to experience companionship, intellectual stimulation, and sexual freedom that was unavailable within the confines of his arranged marriage. It was acceptable for married men to frequent hetairae, as long as it didn't infringe on his duties to his oikos or involve a respectable citizen woman. It's like having a very expensive, highly intellectual, and socially connected friend with benefits, who also happens to charge by the hour. Mainstream historical fact. Hetairae were a distinct class of educated and sophisticated courtesans in ancient Greece, particularly Athens, who provided men with intellectual companionship, entertainment, and sexual services, fulfilling a social role that respectable citizen wives were not expected or permitted to. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some famous hetairae, like Aspasia of Miletus, companion of Pericles, were renowned for their intelligence and oratorical skills, attracting the attention of leading philosophers and statesmen. She was so influential that she was sometimes jokingly, or perhaps seriously, accused of writing Pericles' speeches. Imagine being so brilliant that people suspect you're secretly ghostwriting for the head of state. She was basically the ancient Greek equivalent of a political strategist and socialite, all rolled into one. Open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue about the true social status and agency of hetairae, with some scholars emphasizing their intellectual freedom and influence as a unique form of female power in a patriarchal society, while others contend that they were ultimately still marginalized and exploited women, regardless of their education or wealth. The nuanced interpretation of their role remains a point of discussion. The presence of hetairae highlights the extreme segregation of Athenian society. Respectable women were kept secluded to ensure their purity and the legitimacy of heirs. But this very seclusion created a demand for educated female companionship that their wives could not provide. The hetairae filled this void, creating a parallel social sphere where men could engage in a different kind of male-female interaction. It's important to note that while hetairae offered a form of dating for men, it was a transactional relationship, and not one that typically led to marriage with a citizen man. They operated outside the strict social norms governing citizen women, meaning they didn't enjoy the same protections or social standing as a married Athenian woman, even if they sometimes accumulated considerable wealth and influence. They were, in a sense, a necessary social outlet, but one that remained outside the boundaries of respectable family life. So, for men in ancient Greece, particularly Athens, dating might involve a sophisticated conversation and shared wine with a hetera, rather than a romantic stroll with a future wife. It reveals a society deeply divided by gender roles and social expectations, where emotional and intellectual companionship often had to be sought outside the confines of the marital bed. It's a boring history for sleep, perhaps, but it's a fascinating look at the complex, sometimes contradictory, social outlets for male desire and intellectual curiosity in the ancient world. You've delved into the world of hetairai, understanding how they offered a form of intellectual and social companionship that was unavailable within the strict confines of marriage for citizen women. Now, let's pivot to another crucial aspect of male social life in ancient Greece, one that often provided companionship, emotional intimacy, and even romantic connections, male homosocial bonding, including pederastic relationships. This wasn't dating in the modern sense, but it was a significant sphere of emotional and social connection for men, existing alongside, and sometimes even in preference to, traditional marriage. Imagine yourself as a young Athenian man. From your earliest days, your life revolved around male-dominated spaces. You were educated by male tutors, trained in the gymnasium with other boys and young men, and your social life, even into adulthood, primarily occurred in male-only environments like the symposium. This constant close interaction fostered deep bonds of friendship and camaraderie, often far more intense and emotionally expressive than anything you might experience with your secluded wife. Within this framework, pederasty was a common and accepted, though complex and often debated, even by the Greeks themselves, form of male-male relationship, particularly in certain city-states like Athens and Sparta. This involved an older, aristocratic man, the Erastes lover or mentor, forming a relationship with a younger adolescent boy, the eromenos beloved. This wasn't simply a sexual relationship. It was ideally seen as a form of mentorship and education. The Erastes would guide the eromenos in intellectual, moral, and civic virtues, while the eromenos would, in turn, provide beauty and affection. It was supposed to be a reciprocal exchange, with the older man imparting wisdom and the younger man offering inspiration. It's like a very intense, philosophical Big Brother program, with a highly intimate component. These relationships were often highly idealized in poetry and philosophy, particularly in the works of Plato, who saw them as a path to intellectual and spiritual enlightenment. The gymnasium, the training grounds, were common places for such relationships to form and flourish, as men spent considerable time exercising naked together. This public display of male bodies further underscored the societal acceptance of male physical beauty and erotic attraction between men. Mainstream historical fact. Male homosocial bonding, including pederastic relationships between older men, Erastes, and younger adolescents, eromenos, was an accepted and often idealized aspect of ancient Greek society, particularly in Athens and Sparta, viewed as both an educational and a romantic pursuit. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some city-states, like Crete, there were even more formalized rituals surrounding pederasty, involving the abduction of the eromenos by the Erastes to a remote location for a period of time. followed by a public return and presentation of gifts. It sounds rather dramatic, doesn't it? Like a very structured, somewhat ritualized version of a romantic getaway for mentors and their protégés, complete with souvenirs. Open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue intensely about the precise nature of pederastic relationships in ancient Greece, debating the extent to which they were primarily educational and spiritual versus predominantly sexual, and how societal norms and individual practices varied across different city-states and social classes. The complexities of consent and power dynamics within these relationships also remain a nuanced point of discussion. These male-male relationships often provided the emotional and intellectual intimacy that was largely absent from arranged heterosexual marriages. Men could discuss philosophy, politics, and personal feelings with their male companions in ways they rarely did with their wives. This meant that while marriage secured a man's lineage and household, his deepest emotional connections and intellectual stimulation often came from his relationships with other men. It's crucial to understand that these relationships were not typically seen as alternatives to marriage for adult men. An Erastes was generally expected to eventually marry a woman, establish an oikos, and produce legitimate heirs. Pederasty was often a phase in a young man's life, or an ongoing but separate aspect of an older man's social and emotional world. It existed within a framework where procreation and civic duty through marriage remained paramount. So, for men in ancient Greece, dating and companionship might involve intimate discussions and shared experiences with other men in the gymnasium or at the symposium. This realm of male homosocial bonding provided a vital outlet for emotional and intellectual connection, highlighting the deeply gender-segregated nature of ancient Greek society and the varied forms that love and desire could take outside the strictly utilitarian bonds of marriage. It's a boring history for sleep, perhaps, but it's a fascinating, complex, and often misunderstood aspect of ancient Greek social life. You've seen how male homosocial bonding, including pederastic relationships, offered an avenue for emotional and intellectual connection among men, often distinct from the purpose of marriage. Now, let's consider the central venues where much of this male social life, and indeed, where men might briefly catch sight of women, albeit rarely and fleetingly, took place: the gymnasium and other public spaces. These weren't dating hotspots in the modern sense, but they were the crucial hubs of male interaction, where reputations were built, alliances formed, and masculinity was performed. Imagine yourself as a young Athenian man. Your days outside the home would be largely spent in public. The agora, the bustling marketplace and civic center, was a primary hub. Here, you'd engage in commerce, participate in political discussions, attend legal proceedings, and simply socialize with other men. This was where public life happened. While respectable women were mostly absent, you might occasionally see female slaves or foreign women like hetairai moving through the crowds. It was a place for observation and public discourse, not for romantic overtures. It's like your downtown core, but instead of coffee shops for dates, it's all about civic duty and haggling over olive oil. But the gymnasium was arguably even more significant for male social life and the formation of bonds. This wasn't just a place to work out. It was a comprehensive educational and social institution. Here, you, as a young man, would train your body in wrestling, running, and other athletics, often in the nude. This physical training was considered essential for civic virtue and military readiness. But alongside the physical, there was intellectual and social development. You'd engage in philosophical discussions, listen to orators, and mingle with men of all ages. The gymnasium was where many of the pederastic relationships we discussed previously would form. The older Erastes would observe and interact with the younger Eromenoi, and the close physical proximity and shared activities fostered an environment for these mentor-protege relationships to develop. For many men, these environments provided the deepest emotional and intellectual connections of their lives, more so than their arranged marriages. It's like a combination of a university campus, a sports complex, and a very public, very social spa. Mainstream historical fact. Gymnasia were central male social and educational institutions in ancient Greece, providing spaces for physical training, intellectual discussion, and the formation of homosocial bonds, including pederastic relationships. Here's a quirky tidbit. Beyond formal gymnasia, public baths were also significant social spaces for men, offering opportunities for relaxation, conversation, and continued male bonding. Imagine catching up on the latest political gossip while soaking in a communal tub with your buddies. It certainly puts a different spin on Spa Day, open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue about the extent to which these male-dominated public spaces fostered a sense of male exclusivity that further marginalized women, or if they simply reflected a practical division of labor and social spheres necessary for the functioning of ancient Greek society. The interpretation of gendered public spaces remains a nuanced point of discussion. For women, access to these public spaces was severely limited. A respectable woman would not be found lounging at the agora or exercising in the gymnasium. Her world was indoors, primarily. Her rare public outings, such as religious festivals, were highly chaperoned and strictly regulated, designed to prevent any improper interaction with men outside her family. So, while men had a rich and varied public social life, women's public existence was almost entirely defined by domesticity and religious ritual. This gendered segregation of public spaces meant that the opportunities for men and women to casually interact, let alone date, were virtually non-existent. Men found companionship and social outlets among other men, while women's social lives revolved around female relatives and slaves within the confines of the home. Any encounter between an unrelated man and a respectable woman in a public space would be highly unusual and likely viewed with suspicion, potentially damaging her reputation and her family's honor. So, when you think about dating in ancient Greece, realize that for men, it largely occurred within male homosocial circles in public spaces like the gymnasium and agora, centered around shared activities and intellectual pursuits. For women, it was about maintaining strict seclusion until marriage. The very architecture and social norms of Greek city-states were designed to keep the sexes apart, ensuring that the serious business of marriage remained in the hands of the families, far removed from the unpredictable currents of personal attraction or romantic desire. It's a boring history for sleep. Perhaps, but it's a profound look at how society itself dictated the boundaries of intimacy and interaction. You've just explored how the gymnasium and other public spaces served as crucial hubs for male social bonding, highlighting the extreme gender segregation of ancient Greek society. Now, let's narrow our focus to perhaps the most iconic and essential male social institution in ancient Greece, one that was central to politics, philosophy, and pleasure, the symposium. This wasn't just a party, it was a highly ritualized drinking gathering, almost exclusively for men. And it played a significant role in male companionship, intellectual exchange, and indeed, a certain kind of dating that existed outside of marriage. Imagine yourself as an Athenian citizen, invited to a symposium. You would recline on couches in a private dining room, typically in the host's home, surrounded by other men, friends, family, and intellectual peers. The evening would be structured after dinner. The serious drinking would begin, often diluted wine, accompanied by lively conversation, poetry recitation, music, and games. This was not a chaotic drunken brawl, though those could certainly happen, but a space for intellectual discourse, witty banter, and the deepening of male bonds. It's like a gentleman's club mixed with a philosophy seminar and a frat party, but with much more toga. The symposium was a prime environment for male homosocial interactions, including the formation of pederastic relationships. Older men, the erastes, could engage with younger men, the eromenoi, in intellectual discussions, offering mentorship and guidance. The relaxed atmosphere, fueled by wine, could also foster emotional intimacy and romantic connections between men, openly expressed in poetry and shared moments. For many Greek men, these were the spaces where their deepest emotional and intellectual connections truly flourished, far more so than in their often impersonal marriages. While citizen women were strictly excluded from symposia unless they were heterae or pornai, serving as entertainers or companions, the presence of heterae was common and accepted. These educated courtesans would provide entertainment, intellectual conversation, and, for some, sexual services. They added a layer of sophistication and pleasure to the gathering, allowing men to interact with intelligent, articulate women in a way that was impossible with their secluded wives. So, a man's date at a symposium might involve intellectual sparring with a sharp hetera, rather than a quiet evening with his wife. Mainstream historical fact. The symposium was an essential social institution for elite men in ancient Greece, primarily a private drinking party where men engaged in intellectual discussions, entertainment, and fostered strong male bonds, often including pederastic relationships, and where respectable citizen women were generally excluded. Here's a quirky tidbit. The level of wine consumption at a symposium was carefully managed. A symposiarch master of ceremonies would be appointed to control the mixing of wine with water, ensuring a steady, enjoyable buzz without immediate intoxication, allowing conversation and intellectual debate to thrive. It's like having a designated sober friend, but their job is to make sure everyone drinks just enough to be profound, but not enough to fall off their couch. Open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue about the extent to which symposia contributed to the marginalization of respectable women by providing an alternative male-dominated social sphere for intellectual and emotional fulfillment, or if they simply reflected pre-existing social structures and male cultural practices. The role of the symposium in shaping gender relations remains a nuanced point of discussion. The topics of conversation at a symposium were wide-ranging politics, philosophy, poetry, current events, and, of course, love and desire. Plato's famous Symposium, for instance, is a philosophical dialogue set at such a gathering, where the nature of love, eros, is debated at length. This intellectual freedom and open discussion were precisely what made the symposium so vital for men, allowing for a robust exchange of ideas that was rare in other, more formal settings. For you, a man, the symposium was a place where your wit was sharpened, your alliances solidified, and your emotional needs, perhaps, met in ways your domestic life could not provide. It was a space of camaraderie, competition, and cultural refinement, all lubricated by wine and intellectual stimulation. It was a crucial part of your social identity, distinct from your family life, yet deeply intertwined with your role as a citizen. So, when thinking about dating in ancient Greece, recognize that for men, much of their social and intimate lives outside of procreation and family duty took place in these homosocial, male-only spaces. The symposium was a microcosm of this reality, a place where profound connections were forged, intellectual boundaries pushed, and passions explored, all within a strictly defined, male-centric world. It's a boring history for sleep, perhaps, but it's a fascinating look at the complex social dynamics that shaped relationships in the ancient world, far beyond the confines of traditional marriage. You've just immersed yourself in the world of the symposium, that quintessential male social gathering, which offered intellectual stimulation and companionship for men. But what about when men wanted to influence matters of the heart in a more direct, perhaps even desperate, way, since formal dating was absent and arranged marriages were the norm? People sometimes turned to supernatural means to attract affection, control desire, or even to curse rivals in love. This leads us into the intriguing, sometimes chilling, realm of love charms and spells in ancient Greece. Imagine the desperation of unrequited love, the desire for a rival to be cast aside, or the yearning for a spouse's wandering affections to return. In a world where personal choice in relationships was limited and divine intervention was a commonly accepted reality, it's no surprise that individuals, both men and women, would turn to magic. These weren't whispered sweet nothings. These were elaborate rituals, often involving strange ingredients, incantations, and even dark practices, all aimed at manipulating the powerful force of eros, or desire. You might seek out a sorceress, a wise woman, or someone reputed to have knowledge of such arts. The spells could be broadly categorized. There were philtron love charms designed to inspire affection or desire in another person. These might involve mixing herbs, bodily fluids, or other strange substances into a drink or food meant for the target. Imagine trying to slip a concoction of lizard blood and pigeon feathers into someone's wine, hoping it makes them fall madly in love with you. It sounds less like a romantic gesture and more like a recipe for a very bad stomachache, or perhaps an immediate trip to the ancient Greek equivalent of poison control. Then there were the more sinister katadesmoi curse tablets or binding spells. These were used to prevent a rival from attracting affection, to bind a lover to you, or even to inflict sexual dysfunction on an opponent in a romantic pursuit. These spells often involved writing the curse on a lead tablet, sometimes piercing it with nails, and then burying it in a grave, a well, or a sacred site, invoking chthonic deities or spirits of the dead to enforce the curse. Imagine carving a rival's name into lead, thinking it would make their love life as cold and unresponsive as the metal itself. It certainly beats sending a strongly worded letter, but it's a far cry from healthy relationship communication. Mainstream historical fact: ancient Greeks widely practiced various forms of magic, including love charms, philtra, to attract affection, and binding spells, ketadesmoi, to influence or thwart romantic and sexual relationships, often involving elaborate rituals and invocations of deities or spirits. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some love charms involved sympathetic magic, where actions mimicked the desired outcome. For example, a spell might involve melting a wax doll over a fire, wishing for someone's heart to melt with desire, or spinning a magical wheel to metaphorically draw a lover towards you. It's like trying to manifest your crush by making a tiny, anatomically correct voodoo doll and melting it. Definitely not HR approved. Open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue about the precise social function of love magic in ancient Greece, with some scholars interpreting it as a reflection of individual agency and a means for the disempowered to exert influence in a rigid society, while others contend it primarily highlights widespread anxieties about sexual control, infidelity, and the unpredictable nature of desire. The balance between desperate hope and social manipulation remains a nuanced point of discussion. Both men and women resorted to these practices, often driven by intense emotion and a lack of other avenues for romantic expression or control. For women, especially those in arranged marriages, a love charm might be a desperate attempt to gain the affection of a distant husband, or to ensure his fidelity. For men, it might be about winning the favor of a hetera, or preventing a rival from succeeding in a romantic pursuit. The belief in the efficacy of these spells was widespread, even if their actual success rates were, shall we say, debatable. The very act of performing the ritual, the whispered incantations, the secrecy, might have offered a sense of control in a world where so much was outside individual command. It's a powerful testament to the human desire for connection and control over one's romantic fate, even when conventional means were unavailable. So, when you consider dating in ancient Greece, remember it wasn't just about arranged marriages or male social circles. It also involved a hidden, often dark, world of magical intervention, where people sought to twist the threads of fate and desire with charms and curses. It's a boring history for sleep, perhaps, but it's a fascinating glimpse into the human heart's desperate longing for love and influence, even when resorting to the most unorthodox and uncomfortable means. You've just explored the sometimes desperate, sometimes sinister world of love charms and spells, revealing the lengths to which ancient Greeks went to influence matters of the heart outside of conventional means. Now, let's take a significant detour from our Athenian focus and journey to a very different city-state, one that stands as a remarkable exception to almost everything we've discussed about gender roles and social interaction. Sparta. Here, dating, and indeed, the entire social fabric, operated on an entirely different wavelength, offering its women surprisingly more public roles and a stark contrast to the seclusion of their Athenian counterparts. Imagine leaving the confined Genikon of Athens and stepping into the dusty, sun-drenched plains of Laconia, home of Sparta. Immediately, you'd notice a striking difference in the lives of women. Spartan girls and women were not secluded. Far from it. They engaged in rigorous physical training, often alongside men, participating in athletic competitions. They ran, wrestled, threw the discus and javelin, all aimed at fostering strong, healthy bodies capable of bearing robust warrior sons. This was a public, visible, and celebrated aspect of their lives. It's like moving from a rigid finishing school to a co-ed Olympic training camp. Only everyone is wearing very short tunics. This emphasis on physical prowess and public visibility meant that Spartan girls and young women had far more opportunities for interaction, albeit within a highly structured and state-controlled environment. While dating, in the modern sense, still didn't exist, they were seen, observed, and participated in communal activities in a way that would shock other Greeks. Their bodies were admired for their strength and their potential for procreation, not hidden away in modesty. This created a very different dynamic between the sexes, one rooted in shared civic purpose and physical excellence, rather than strict segregation. Marriage in Sparta, as we briefly touched on earlier, was also highly unusual. It was still arranged, but with a unique ritual often involving a mock abduction of the bride. who would have her hair shorn and be dressed in male attire before being secretly visited by her groom. The Spartan husband would continue to live in the barracks with his fellow soldiers, only visiting his wife secretly at night for a period, specifically for procreation. This meant Spartan wives often managed their households with significant autonomy and saw their husbands only fleetingly for years. This strange arrangement, designed to intensify passion and encourage robust offspring, meant their marital relationships developed under very different conditions, often without the constant domestic presence of a husband. Mainstream historical fact. Spartan women, unlike those in most other Greek city-states, engaged in public physical training and athletic competitions, were not secluded, and enjoyed a relatively higher degree of social visibility and autonomy, particularly within their households. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Spartan peplos, a simple garment, was famously, or infamously, known for being thigh-revealing, the phinomeris. While scandalous to outsiders, in Sparta, it was purely practical, allowing for freedom of movement during athletic activities. So, the Spartans basically invented athletic wear, and then made it their daily uniform, long before Lululemon existed. Open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue intensely about whether the unique freedoms and public roles of Spartan women truly constituted empowerment, or if they were primarily pragmatic state policies designed to support the male military system, ultimately serving patriarchal and eugenic objectives. The balance of their agency versus their utility remains a central scholarly debate. The Spartan system also allowed women to own and inherit property, an astonishing right for women in the ancient world. Over time, Spartan women came to own a significant portion of the land. This economic power granted them considerable authority within their households, managing estates and overseeing the helot labor force. While not directly political power, it meant they wielded a different kind of influence than their Athenian counterparts. So, while dating as a romantic pursuit was still absent, the social and interactive landscape for Spartan women was vastly different. They lived a life of public visibility, physical rigor, and domestic autonomy that was an anomaly in ancient Greece. Their relationships with men, both premarital and marital, were shaped by unique societal norms aimed at producing the most formidable warriors and maintaining the strength of the Spartan state. It's a boring history for sleep, perhaps, but it's a fascinating and provocative look at a society that dared to defy conventional Greek gender roles, albeit for its own distinct, and often ruthless, reasons. You've just been granted a glimpse into the truly anomalous world of Spartan women, a striking contrast to the seclusion common elsewhere in Greece. Now, regardless of whether you were an Athenian bride stepping into a new, unfamiliar house, or a Spartan wife continuing your unique marital arrangement, the moment after the wedding ceremony marked a profound shift in your life, the transition to a highly segregated domestic existence. For women, this was the central reality of marriage, a life largely confined to the household, focused on management and procreation. Imagine that initial journey to your husband's oikos. For an Athenian bride, this was the first time you were truly entering your new home as its mistress. You, a teenager, would be taking charge of a complex domestic unit. Your primary duties would immediately begin managing the household, overseeing slaves if your family could afford them, preparing food, managing provisions, and, most crucially, supervising the weaving of textiles. Weaving was not just a chore, it was a highly respected skill and a vital economic activity for the household, often producing clothing for the family and potentially goods for trade. It's like being immediately promoted to CEO of a small but essential manufacturing company, with no prior experience. For Athenian women, the gynaikon, the women's quarters, truly became your domain. While not always a separate, locked-off part of the house, it was the social sphere where you were expected to spend the vast majority of your time. Male visitors would not enter these areas, and your husband would typically conduct his business and entertain male friends in the public areas of the house. Your social circle would largely consist of your female relatives, female slaves, and perhaps a few trusted female neighbors or friends, if allowed. Your world, once confined to your father's house, was now confined to your husband's house, equally secluded. This domestic segregation ensured the wife's chastity and the legitimacy of heirs, which was paramount for continuing the male lineage and securing property. Your husband, while living in the same house, would often have a very different social life, spending his days in the agora, gymnasium, or at symposia with other men. Your shared time would be primarily for meals and the quiet moments of the evening, and, of course, for procreation. The expectation wasn't constant companionship, but rather a harmonious domestic partnership built on your complementary roles. Mainstream historical fact. After marriage, respectable women in ancient Greece, particularly in Athens, spent the vast majority of their lives within the private sphere of the household, managing domestic affairs and raising children, with their social interactions largely confined to female relatives and slaves. Here's a quirky tidbit. While the woman managed the household, the male head of the oikos, the kyrios, would ideally educate his wife on financial matters and household management. Some texts even show him instructing her on the proper care of slaves or the efficient storage of food, turning the marriage into a perpetual domestic apprenticeship for the young wife. It's like your husband giving you a detailed onboarding manual on how to run his entire life, and then expecting you to ace the final exam. Open scholarly debate phrases. Historians still argue about the precise emotional realities of these highly segregated marriages, with some scholars emphasizing the potential for deep affection and respect to grow over time through shared responsibilities and child-rearing, while others suggest that the lack of initial choice and pervasive social segregation could lead to emotional isolation for women. The nature of intimacy within these domestic confines remains a nuanced point of discussion. For Spartan women, the domestic transition was different but equally focused. While you had more public freedom to train, your marital home was still your primary sphere of operation. With your husband often in the barracks, you, the Spartan wife, held an even greater degree of practical management over the household and your family's estates and helots. Your social interactions, while perhaps more public than an Athenian woman's daily life, would still revolve around other Spartan women and the specific demands of your civic role in raising children. Your home life was often a singularly female-run enterprise. In both cases, regardless of the subtle differences between city-states, the marital home became the woman's primary universe. Her duties were clear. Her role defined to be the efficient, chaste manager of the oikos and the fertile producer of legitimate heirs. The romantic notions of dating and passionate courtship were irrelevant to this domestic reality. Marriage was a functional partnership, a societal pillar, and its daily rhythm was one of diligent management, not romantic exploration. It's a boring history for sleep, perhaps, but it's a stark look at the deeply practical and often segregated foundations of marital life in ancient Greece. You've navigated the intricate, often perplexing, landscape of relationships in ancient Greece, from the absence of modern dating to the highly segregated domestic sphere after marriage. Now, as we reach the quiet conclusion of our journey, let's reflect on the overarching truth about love and duty in this ancient world. Because for the ancient Greeks, particularly in cities like Athens, love was fundamentally distinct from marriage, and duty, rather than romance, was the undeniable bedrock of most unions. Imagine a clear distinction in your mind. On one side, you have eros, that powerful, often irrational, passionate desire, the kind that strikes like a lightning bolt, inspiring poets and leading to dramatic, often tragic, myths. This eros certainly existed in ancient Greece, but it was rarely considered the proper foundation for marriage. It was too wild, too unpredictable, too fleeting to secure the lineage and property that marriage was designed to protect. You might experience eros for a hetaira, or a young man might feel it for another man in a pederastic relationship. But it wasn't something you built a household on, at least not if you were a respectable citizen. It's like having a fiery, passionate affair with a celebrity, but then settling down and marrying the stable, reliable accountant your parents approved of. On the other side, you have the practical, functional union of marriage, born of negotiation, dowries, and family alliances. This was about oikos household and polis city-state, about ensuring the continuation of the male line, the security of property, and the stability of society. Love, if it emerged, was a gentle, quiet affection. A companionate love that might grow over years of shared domesticity and the raising of children. It was a byproduct of duty, not its primary driver. It was about philia, a kind of friendship or affection, rather than the consuming fire of eros. Historians still argue about the precise prevalence and emotional texture of love within these arranged marriages. While the literary and philosophical texts often highlight male homosocial bonds or the intense passions of eros outside marriage, we have far fewer direct insights into the inner emotional lives of married couples, particularly women. This makes it challenging to truly gauge how much love, in our modern sense, might have existed behind the closed doors of the gynaikon, mainstream historical fact. While various forms of love and desire were recognized in ancient Greece eros, philia, agape. Marriage for respectable citizens was fundamentally a social and economic institution focused on procreation and property. Distinct from the concept of romantic love as its primary foundation, here's a quirky tidbit. The wedding ceremony itself. The gamos often included rituals designed to symbolize the bride's loss of childhood and her transition into her new husband's household, sometimes involving a mock struggle or a symbolic separation from her mother. It was less about joining two people in love and more about severing old ties and forging new, utilitarian ones. It's like a corporate merger where the new employee has to ritually burn their old ID badge. Open scholarly debate phrase. Scholars continue to debate the extent to which a companionate form of love philia could develop within the context of arranged marriages, with some arguing it was a common and valued aspect of successful unions, while others maintained that the lack of initial choice and the emphasis on duty meant emotional intimacy remained largely secondary. The subjective experience of love in ancient Greek marriage remains a rich area for scholarly inquiry. Your life as an ancient Greek, therefore, particularly as a respectable woman, was a constant performance of duty. Your very existence was circumscribed by the needs of your family and the state. Your relationships, especially marriage, were designed not for your personal happiness or romantic fulfillment, but for societal stability and continuation. The vibrant, passionate forms of love existed, but they often occurred on the fringes of respectable society, in the realms of hetaerai, or between men. So, as we conclude our deep dive into dating in ancient Greece, understand that it was a landscape utterly alien to our modern sensibilities. It was a world where practicality trumped passion, where family superseded individual choice, and where duty was the quiet, unwavering heartbeat of relationships. There were no dating apps, no awkward first encounters, just a relentless march towards an arranged future, often with a stranger. It's a boring history for sleep. Yes, but it's a profound testament to how different human connection, at its most fundamental level, can be across time and culture. And now, this fascinating, unromantic journey through the past gently fades into the quiet of the present. Now, gently close your eyes. Let the sounds around you soften, just like the echoes of ancient Greece begin to fade. Feel the quiet hum of history settling into the peaceful corners of your mind. Tonight, you've glimpsed a world where love and duty walked very different paths, where connections were forged by necessity more than by desire. The whispers of old traditions and the quiet rhythm of lives lived for family and state now mingle with the soft hum of your fan, carrying you further into comfort. Let the images drift, dissolving into the peaceful quiet that now surrounds you. There's nothing left to do but simply be. Drift, now, into a deep, peaceful slumber. End of script. Sweet dreams.